reclaiming economic sovereignty has become one of the central pillars of Africa's resistance to Western influence. For decades, many African nations have operated under economic models and policies shaped not by their own governments, but by international institutions such as the International Monetary Fund, IMF, the World Bank, and Western donor countries. These institutions, often dominated by American and European interests, have imposed structural adjustment programs, austerity measures, and trade conditions that have prioritized Western access to African markets and resources, frequently at the expense of local development and autonomy. Now, a growing number of African nations are rejecting these externally imposed economic frameworks in favor of homegrown solutions tailored to the unique social, historical, and economic realities of their people. One of the clearest indicators of this shift is the move toward regional economic integration within Africa itself. The African Continental Free Trade Area, AfCFTA, launched in 2021, represents a bold step toward building intra-African economic power. It aims to eliminate tariffs on 90% of goods traded between African countries and create a single market for goods and services. By strengthening internal trade, African countries reduce their dependence on Western export markets, thereby reclaiming greater control over their economic destiny. This is a sharp departure from the colonial-era economic structure that forced African nations into roles as exporters of raw materials and importers of Western finished goods. The AfCFTA is more than just an economic agreement. It is a political statement about Africa's intention to determine its own economic future. Beyond regional trade, African leaders are rethinking their relationships with Western investors and multinational corporations. In the past, Western companies have often gained access to Africa's vast natural resources, oil, minerals, agriculture, through opaque deals, tax exemptions, and legal loopholes that provided minimal benefit to the local population. Today, governments in countries like Tanzania, the Democratic Republic of Congo, and Ghana are renegotiating or even canceling such contracts to ensure a fairer share of profits remains within their borders. These decisions are not made lightly. They often come with backlash from foreign governments and investors. However, they are increasingly seen as necessary to break cycles of dependency and build truly sovereign economies. Currency independence is another key battleground. Many West African countries still use the CFA franc, a colonial-era currency tied to the French treasury and pegged to the euro. This arrangement has long been criticized as a mechanism of neocolonial control, limiting monetary policy flexibility and benefiting French economic interests. In response, a movement to replace the CFA franc with a new, regionally managed currency has gained momentum. Although progress has been slow and fraught with political complications, the very existence of such a movement reflects a growing determination to assert control over fundamental economic tools. Control of currency is not just technical. It is symbolic of broader sovereignty. Debt is another area where African countries are challenging the status quo. For years, debt dependency has acted as a leash tying African nations to Western financial powers. Many of these debts, often accumulated under unfair or corrupt circumstances, have ballooned to unsustainable levels. Servicing them has meant cutting public spending, privatizing essential services, and sacrificing developmental priorities. Increasingly, African leaders are questioning the legitimacy of some of these debts and seeking alternative financing from non-Western partners or regional development banks. Countries like Zambia and Kenya have turned to China or regional bond markets to diversify their debt portfolio. Though this too comes with its own risks. The point, however, is not simply about shifting lenders. It is about exercising the freedom to choose financial partners based on national interests, not foreign agendas. Agriculture and food production are also part of the economic sovereignty equation. For too long, African countries have relied heavily on imported food, much of it subsidized by Western governments. This dependency has not only undermined local farmers, but also made African countries vulnerable to global supply chain disruptions and foreign pricing policies. In response, several governments are launching initiatives to boost domestic food production through subsidies, research, and investment in infrastructure. Ethiopia's wheat self-sufficiency campaign and Nigeria's rice revolution are two prominent examples. Same person, these programs aim to empower local producers, reduce import bills, and build resilient food systems that are not beholden to Western agricultural exports. Technology and innovation represent new frontiers in the push for economic self-reliance. Instead of depending solely on Western tech firms and digital infrastructure, African nations are increasingly investing in their own startups, fintech solutions, and research institutions. Rwanda, Kenya, and Nigeria have emerged as regional tech hubs, with governments and private investors supporting homegrown solutions to local problems. From mobile banking to agricultural data platforms, these innovations are not only economically empowering, but also culturally relevant. Rejecting the model of passive consumption of Western tech, Africa is moving toward digital sovereignty, where data ownership, local talent development, and technological autonomy become central to the continent's economic growth. The role of education and skills development cannot be overlooked in this context. Many African education systems have historically been geared toward producing workers who fit into Western-dominated economies rather than entrepreneurs, inventors, or policymakers who build independent national economies. Today, there is a push to decolonize education, promote STEM learning, and align academic institutions with national development goals. By reshaping curricula, investing in vocational training, and prioritizing African languages and perspectives, countries aim to equip their populations with the tools to build and sustain sovereign economies. What unites all these efforts is a fundamental shift in mindset. From dependency to self-determination. Africa is not seeking isolation from the world, but rather equitable participation. Economic sovereignty does not mean cutting off all ties with the West. It means engaging on terms that are fair, transparent, and respectful of African interests. Religion is another field in which cultural imperialism has left lasting effects. Christianity and Islam, both introduced through conquest and colonization in different eras, have deeply influenced African societies, while millions of Africans practice these religions with deep sincerity. The manner in which Western missionaries historically imposed Christian doctrines often led to the demonization of traditional spiritual systems. Indigenous African religions were labeled as pagan, backward, or even demonic. This has led to the decline of indigenous belief systems, many of which emphasize community, environmental stewardship, and harmony. In recent years, there has been a revival of interest in African spirituality, not necessarily as a rejection of global religions, but as a reclaiming of ancestral wisdom and a broader redefinition of what it means to be spiritual within an African context. Education systems have long been used as tools of cultural domination. Many African school curricula are based on Western models filled with foreign historical perspectives, literary canon, and scientific paradigms, while marginalizing African knowledge, achievements, and philosophies. This imbalance shapes how young Africans view the world and themselves. A student can complete their entire formal education without studying African philosophers, learning about pre-colonial governance systems, or reading literature in their own language. This absence is not accidental. It is a legacy of colonialism designed to produce subjects who mimic Western thought rather than thinkers who lead from African values. Movements to decolonize education are now gaining ground, seeking to diversify curricula, include African scholarship, and foster critical thinking rooted in African experiences. Consumerism is another vehicle of cultural imperialism. Western brands and lifestyles are often portrayed as symbols of success and modernity. From fast food chains to luxury goods, Western consumer culture has spread rapidly across African cities, sometimes displacing local products and reshaping tastes and priorities. The preference for foreign goods over locally made products, for instance, undermines local economies and fosters psychological dependence. To counter this, initiatives promoting Made in Africa products are emerging, encouraging consumers to support local businesses, crafts, and traditions. This shift is not merely about economics. It is about affirming that African-made goods ideas and aesthetics are valuable and worthy of pride. Social values and norms are also influenced by cultural imperialism. Ideas about beauty, gender roles, success, and even family structure are often imported from Western societies through media and education. For example, Eurocentric beauty standards, light skin, straight hair, slim body types, have long been promoted as ideals, leading to harmful practices like skin bleaching and a devaluation of African physical traits. In response, cultural movements like the natural hair revolution and body positivity campaigns have gained momentum, empowering individuals to embrace their natural appearance and redefine beauty on their own terms. These cultural shifts help dismantle internalized colonialism and promote self-acceptance. The digital age has accelerated the spread of Western cultural norms, but it also offers new tools for resistance. Social media, podcasts, blogs, and online communities allow African voices to bypass traditional Western gatekeepers and connect directly with audiences. These platforms are being used to revive indigenous knowledge, share local stories, and build cultural pride. Creators are using technology not just to consume global culture, but to produce and export African culture to the world on their own terms. This digital self-representation is a key front in the broader struggle against cultural imperialism. Redefining political alliances is an essential strategy in Africa's emerging stand against entrenched Western influence. Historically, The continent's political alignments have been shaped by colonial legacies and Cold War geopolitics, often placing African states in a position of dependency on Western powers. The post-independence era saw many African leaders look to Europe and the United States for aid, recognition, and political legitimacy. However, this reliance frequently came at the cost of national autonomy. Conditional loans, military interventions, election influence, and diplomatic pressure became tools through which the West maintained significant control over African governance. Now, a growing number of African nations are challenging these dynamics by forging new alliances, asserting non-alignment, and engaging in multilateralism grounded in African interests, rather than foreign agendas. One of the most notable shifts in political alignment is Africa's expanding diplomatic and economic engagement with non-Western powers, particularly China, Russia, Turkey, and India. These relationships offer African countries alternatives to traditional Western partnerships, allowing for a diversification of political and economic options. China, for instance, has become Africa's largest trading partner and a key investor in infrastructure projects. Unlike many Western institutions, Chinese loans often come with fewer overt political conditions, which appeals to African governments seeking funding for development without the entanglements of Western-style conditionality. Though these relationships are not without controversy or risks, they mark a decisive departure from Western hegemony in African political life. Russia's re-entry into African politics has also been strategic. It has positioned itself as a partner in military cooperation, resource development, and anti-Western solidarity. This has resonated in countries that have grown weary of Western criticism and interference in domestic affairs. The growing number of defense agreements, energy partnerships, and high-level summits between African and Russian leaders highlights a deliberate recalibration of alliances in countries like Mali, Burkina Faso, and the Central African Republic. Russian support has replaced traditional Western military assistance, with governments citing sovereignty, self-defense, and the need for partnerships based on mutual respect. Pan-Africanism is re-emerging as a political philosophy guiding these realignments. Rooted in the anti-colonial struggles of the 20th century, Pan-Africanism calls for greater unity among African states and a shared commitment to continental self-determination. This ideology has gained fresh relevance as African leaders seek collective strength in the global arena. Regional bodies like the African Union's AU are being repositioned not just as forums for dialogue, but as instruments of coordinated political action. The IU's increasingly assertive stance on international matters, from rejecting external interference in national elections to calling for permanent representation on the UN Security Council, signals Africa's intent to reshape global governance frameworks that have historically marginalized the continent. Diplomatic solidarity among African countries is becoming more prominent, especially in response to Western pressure or sanctions. When individual states face external intervention, such as economic sanctions, travel bans on leaders, or public condemnation of domestic policies, regional neighbors are increasingly standing in support rather than isolation. This collective resistance undermines the effectiveness of divide and rule strategies historically employed by foreign powers. For instance, recent sanctions imposed on certain African nations by the European Union or the United States have sparked regional critiques and calls for sovereign respect, revealing a shift in political culture toward unity in the face of external coercion. Africa is also asserting more independence in international institutions. Traditionally, African states have participated in global forums largely as recipients of aid and policy advice. Now, there is a concerted effort to participate as equal partners. At the World Trade Organization, International Monetary Fund, and United Nations, African countries are pushing back against one-sided rules, demanding greater representation, and aligning more closely with the Global South to amplify their voices. The call for reforming global institutions to reflect current realities, including demographic shifts, economic contributions, and geopolitical importance, is not just a procedural demand, but a political reassertion of Africa's right to shape the global order. Security alliances are another area where African states are exploring new models. For decades, military aid and partnerships with Western countries, particularly the US and France, have defined security policies across the continent. These relationships have included training, arms supplies, intelligence sharing, and joint operations, especially in counterterrorism. However, the effectiveness and motivations of such collaborations are increasingly being questioned. In countries like Niger and Chad, there is growing skepticism about whether Western military presence actually contributes to long-term stability or simply serves foreign strategic interests. Consequently, some governments are reevaluating these alliances, expelling foreign troops, or seeking regional alternatives, such as the G5 Sahel Joint Force or partnerships with emerging global powers. Domestic political rhetoric is also evolving. Leaders, intellectuals, and civil society groups are more openly critiquing Western hypocrisy in global politics, highlighting how democratic values are selectively applied, how economic partnerships often remain exploitative, and how media narratives continue to portray Africa through a lens of deficiency and crisis. This rhetorical shift is not just populist posturing. It reflects a deeper desire to craft an African-centered political identity, one that is no longer reactive to the West, but proactive in setting its own agenda. The increasing confidence with which African leaders speak on international platforms signals a broader cultural and political transformation. At the grassroots level, political realignment is being influenced by popular movements and youth activism. Across many African nations, young people are increasingly questioning the legitimacy of political systems that are overly dependent on Western validation or financial support. Social movements are demanding accountability not just from domestic leaders, but also from international institutions that have long influenced national policy. These movements are often deeply aware of the history of imperialism and neocolonialism, and they articulate a vision of politics grounded in justice, dignity, and autonomy. Their influence is pushing political discourse toward a more independent and assertive stance, challenging both internal corruption and external manipulation. Redefining political alliances, therefore, is not only about choosing different international partners. It is about building a new political architecture where African priorities lead the conversation, where sovereignty is respected, and where alliances are based on mutual benefit rather than historical subjugation.